So I'm now really excited to welcome Dr. Niels Skovgaard-Olsen, who's based at the Department of Psychology at the University of Freiburg in Germany. So Niels's work focuses on topics at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and linguistics, or more broadly, cognitive science. Some of his work is purely theoretical and others is empirical, with a key focus on reasoning and language. So Niels completed his DPhil in 2014 at the University of Constance and his PhD in psychology from the University of Freiburg in 2017, which does mean that he has two PhDs, which seems to be a first in our series. In 2022, Niels received the German Research Council funding to work on as a PI on his project Norm Conflicts and Rationality, which is where he is now. He has a very impressive publication record. You can see publications in journals like JEP General, PSBB, Cognition, Psych Review, and has presented his work at a wide variety of conferences, including being a regular presenter at the London Reasoning Workshop. One of the things that really excited us about Niels' work is the ambition, that he doesn't seem to be fazed by the complexity of a question, something that some of us might try and shy away from, whereas Niels is able to really try and figure out a method to effectively unpack these particularly complex and difficult questions. So we're really delighted to introduce Niels for his talk, Norm, Conflict and Morality, the Conflict Model of Moral Decision-Making. Tusen tak, Niels, for being here, and pleased to take it away.
Okay, then thanks a lot for this opportunity and for this introduction. Yeah, I'm here to present, as was mentioned, work on norm conflicts and now in moral psychology. And this is joint work with Christoph Klauer. And of course, in moral psychology, the kind of norm conflicts that's most salient is the one that you have in trolley cases between utilitarianism and deontology, which has also been investigating a lot of other types of scenarios. And this is just the classic case, which all of you know, where you have a choice between sacrificing the life of one innocent person to save the lives of 5 persons from a runaway trolley in a switch version, or you can, here in a push version, push an innocent person in front of the trolley to save the lives of 5 people, and you have diverging predictions or prescriptions by utilitarianism, which looks at the overall consequences, and deontology, which prohibits sacrificing the lives of an innocent person. Now, there has been a vast literature starting from this, and I want to focus here on a particular debate. And it's one which has, on the one hand, Kahane and co-authors, who have been arguing that a dissociation between accepting instrumental harm in sacrificial dilemma and showing an impartial concern for the greater good exists. And he voices a skepticism that performance in such sacrificial dilemmas tell us as much about participants' adherence to the positive core of utilitarianism, which is nowadays associated with the effective altruism program through the work of the philosopher Peter Singer, for instance. And there's a lot of findings in the literature which you can point to motivate such skepticism. You have the findings that phenogates like patients with damage to ventral medial prefrontal cortex have a high rate of utilitarian responses. You find the positive association with subclinical psychopathy and utilitarian responses. And some studies, although not all studies, have found that normal adults under the influence of alcohol tend to have more pronounced utilitarian response pattern. But none of this really suggests that they are much concerned about the positive core of utilitarianism. So this is the one side of the debate. Then we also had a response by Conway all, and I can see he was in the audience before at least, and they apply a process dissociation method, which we will return to, but on the conceptual level, they point out you can have a taxonomy of utilitarianism. So you can have participants producing sacrificial judgments that coincide with what utilitarianism predicts as a level 1, On a level 2, you have such judgments because participants engage in aggregate cost-benefit reasoning. On level 3, you have such responses because participants have a general moral concern for the greater good within the context of the sacrifice dilemmas. And on level 4, you have such judgments because participants have a general impartial concern for the greater good, which makes them care about maximizing the well-being of socially distant humans and animals. And on the 5th level, you have such judgments because participants also have explicit commitments to utilitarianism, which they can defend and articulate. And none of these parties to this discussion really assume that participants aspire to level 4 and 5. So the question at stake is whether an empirical case can be made for level 3. And like earlier work by Green, Kahane all used a classification, which is very widespread in the literature, where you declare action judgments as utilitarian and inaction judgments as deontological. But it has been pointed out in this context that because the defining properties of a consequence-driven response and a norm-based response are not directly manipulated, bias towards action is confounded with utilitarian responses, and bias towards inaction is confounded with deontological responses on this traditional classification. And this is then what motivates the use of process dissociation methods by Conway and Gawronski and others. And in this particular paper by Gawronski, all in 2017, this takes the form of developing new stimulus materials that factorially combine action and inaction according to deontological norms and utilitarian consequences. They then present a processing tree model where you have an MPT model where you have participants can enter in a latent state where their responses are driven by consequences. And here on the right-hand side, you have the predictions across 4 conditions. So basically, they react with an action response if the benefits of the sacrifice are greater than the cost of sacrificing an innocent person. And if they don't enter into this latent state, then you can have that they enter into a norm-based response state where they provide an inaction response if deontological norms prohibit acting, and an action response if deontological norms prescribe acting. And if this doesn't occur, then you can have an inaction bias where you just invariably respond inaction across condition, or an action bias where you invariably respond action across conditions. And to study it, they don't use the trolley cases, but different real life scenarios. Here from the medical field, so you're supposed to imagine that you're a doctor, and here there's an outbreak of a disease. It could also be with vaccines, and then you manipulate the consequences and whether the deontological norms prescribe or proscribe acting. I think all of this is great, but we have also tried to extend it in 2 respects. The first one was something that we did in a paper that came out this year on invariance violations, which is something that's been found in different types of process dissociation models, and also here in this model. And the problem is that you have 4 conditions, and here you have the conditional probabilities of producing the categorical responses in the 4 conditions, which is parameterized by the model parameters, and the C and Ni parameters, and you can see that the C parameters are set the same across condition as are the N parameters. So they are assumed to be invariant. And we tried to relax this assumption, but in order to do so, we needed more degrees of freedom in the data. So we provided a 3rd response option, which was that participants could select skip. And this then enabled us to estimate separate C parameters and N parameters, as well as the skip parameter in an extended CNIS model. To fit the model, we used a hierarchical latent trait model that Christoph Klauer has developed, where you estimate on the individual level CNIS parameters for each participant, and you also model the covariant matrix So you allow them to be correlated, and you have means distribution to look at central tendencies. And then we did a model comparison, and what we found in that paper was that the model that relaxed the invariance assumption was the better fitting model. But today I want to focus on a different challenge with this model, and that's the insensitivity to conflict. So the CNI model does not have a mechanism whereby participants are sensitive to the difference between congruent and incongruent conditions, cases where utilitarianism and deontology produce the same predictions and where they produce divergent predictions. Instead, conflicts are preempted by the dominance of consequences over norms built into the model. And so we try to extend the model. We start with our CNIS model. So where we have the separate C and N parameters and also the skip parameters built in. And now we apply this model for the congruent stimuli. For the incongruent stimuli, we also use this model, but now we embed it under a further process. And that's the process where participants can detect that there's a conflict between deontology and utilitarianism. If they don't detect it, then they're down in the old branch of the model. If they do detect it, then they have a conflict that can be resolved. And they can either be resolved in the C way or the N way, based on the relative weight of these parameters. And if they don't resolve it, then they can produce a skip response. So a prediction of this model is that you should have more skip responses in the incongruent cases than the congruent cases. And to fit this model, we needed further degrees of freedom. So we had two versions of the CNI stimulus material, one where we had an intended means manipulation and one where we had a foreseeable side effect manipulation. And this was presented within subject over 2 test sessions. And this is the familiar distinction between whether the sacrifice is a causal requisite for saving the lives of 5 people, or whether it's just a foreseeable side effect. Then we also looked at the studies from Kahane et al. And Conway et al. And collected some of these covariances, which have either an altruistic or an egoistic bent that they used. For instance, they looked at a paper by Thompson, where she suggested that one should investigate trilemmas, because once you have the possibility not only to sacrifice the lives of an innocent third person, but to sacrifice your own life or do nothing, you'll then realize that you have no business sacrificing the lives of other people if you wouldn't be prepared to accept this burden on yourself. Then we measured empathy on a scale and primary psychopathy, and we also used some more dilemmas developed by Kahane et al., which are greater good scenarios, and there you have a different mode conflict, and that's between doing something altruistic for strangers or doing something that's self-serving or serves your family or your relatives. Then there was a scale on the extent to which participants identify with all of humanity, their local community, or their home country. And we measured whether they were attracted to rational egoism, moral egoism, or psychological egoism. And in addition, this already packed experiment also had a scorekeeping task. And this is something we have applied in other domains, so in relation to conditionals or epistemic modals, where we're interested in tapping into participants' reflective attitudes. And so here we present participants with a conflict between response patterns by fictive peers, and they start criticizing one another. And now participants should take up a stance in this dispute, so whose criticism is most compelling. And they should also apply a sanction. So this study was run on Mechanical Turk, and so they should decide whether they want to, whose hit they wanted to approve. So who gets the credit for completing the task in the correct way. And we applied the scorekeeping paradigm both in the intended means and the foreseeable side effect version of the CNI scenarios. And we also applied it to the greater good scenarios. And so here you had a different conflict. So one of the avatars was advancing the view that it's morally permitted to do something that is helping strangers in distant countries, but it's something that's supererogatory. And the other side of the debate was to say that it's morally obligatory to forgo your self-serving purposes and help strangers in need. And to investigate these reflective attitudes, we fitted different latent classes and compared them with different number of solutions: 2 latent classes, 3 latent classes, 4 latent classes, and the 4 latent class model was the best fitting model. And so here we can illustrate the 4 different latent classes that we have labeled here. You can see the frequency on the left side of the screen. And then you have the posterior probabilities of producing the different scorekeeping behaviors. So we have the latent class of deontology. These will be participants who approve the hit of the deontological avatar in both the intended means and the foreseeable side effect version of the scenarios. And we can then see that they also accept the criticism of utilitarianism. And then the utilitarian participants would have the flipped behavior. And then we had a class of participants following the doctrine of double effects, which is the switching between here in the intended means version of the scenarios, going with the deontological side and permitting to do the sacrifice when it's a mere side effect, and thus siding with the utilitarian avatar here in the side effect version of the scenarios. And then we had a 4th class of participants who don't show strong preferences in either way in the CNI scenarios, but who have a distinctive behavior here in the greater good scenarios. These are the participants who deem it morally obligatory to do the altruistic thing, in contrast to the other. And here you can then also see the posterior distributions on the greater good scenarios themselves for these latent classes. There are rates of producing the altruistic response, and you see that there's one class that stands out, and this is the participants who committed to altruism in the scorekeeping task. So they have a higher rate of doing the altruistic thing in these scenarios. So now we have our conflict model, and we wanted to do a model comparison. First, there's a first contrast here where we have the CNIS model. We allow different C and N parameters for intended means and side effect versions of the scenarios, but we enforce the invariance assumption so that we only estimate 1 C and 1 N parameter for each. And then we have the model that relaxes this assumption, that has separate C and N parameters within each condition. And then we have the conflict models, and here we have different instantiations that differ on the number of C and N parameters that they use, and also whether they use the latent classes to inform estimated means, so group differences in the means of the estimated parameters. And the first contrast here, where you have a model with and without the invariance assumption, you see that the better fitting model is the one with without the invariance assumption, which is replicating our earlier work. Now we throw in the conflict models to the comparison, and we find that the conflict models were better fitting, and if you also use the latent classes to inform different group means in the distributions, then these were the better fitting models of those that we looked at here. So now we can look at some further aspects of our data. We had this trilemma version. We have our latent classes. We can see participants who committed to utilitarianism, they have a higher posterior probability of sacrificing another innocent person. And participants who committed to deontology have a higher posterior probability of doing nothing, whereas participants committed to altruism has the highest posterior probability of sacrificing themselves. Also, when we look at primary psychopathy and rational egoism, we see this distinctive pattern that the higher participants score on these dimensions, the higher posterior probability of sacrificing an other innocent person and lower posterior probability of sacrificing themselves. And we have the reverse finding for identification with all of humanity and participants' empathy scores. We have a new conflict parameter, and so here we look at a relationship between it and a measure of self-criticism, which is for participants who committed to a particular view in the scorekeeping task, their posterior probability of accepting the criticism of that view. And we see that there's this positive relationship between these two measures. Then we also have our 4 latent classes, and we have our further covariates, and now we can look at relationships in the partial correlations between our covariates in a structural equation model and the CNN parameters estimated by the conflict model. And what you see is that moral egoism is negatively associated here with the CNN parameters in this latent class. Also here, which is altruism, and here with deontology, you also have this negative association. You have it as well here down here with utilitarianism. Then we find similarly for psychological egoism, negative associations with the CNN parameters here for the class of deontology. And here for utilitarianism, we find negative associations between primary psychopathies and the CNN parameters of the model. So to wrap things up, what have we done? We have extended the CNI model to avoid the invariance assumption and the lack of conflict sensitivity built into the model. And then you have here a progression of process dissociation models. So first work was by Conway and Gawronski in 2013, where they presented a first PD model. And then there was an extension by Gawronski over to a CNI model a couple of years later. And then we removed the invariance assumption in a further extension, and then also estimated individual CNI S parameters. And then here now we permit also that participants can detect conflicts, and we use latent classes to inform the parameter estimates. And so we have found in this case of studying norm conflicts that we can estimate latent classes via the scorekeeping task. We can investigate individual variations in the model parameters. And if we return to this discussion between Kahane et al. And Conway et al., we find, like Conway et al., that there's evidence of a level 3 commitment to utilitarianism in the participants, because we find negative associations with primary psychopathy and moral egoism and the C parameters. But we don't find this unrestricted altruistic behavior at personal costs. It's only a small class of participants who have such response patterns. And now I'm happy to take questions.